Alright Reddit, what is your spookiest or most unexplainable event that has ever happened to you? Serious. When I was 7, my family made a quick road trip to visit my grandma who was in hospice. We got back home late at night and my sister and I saw our grandma sitting in the rocking chair in our room. The rocking chair that had belonged to her husband. Our mom walked in and told us that grandma had died and we were gonna drive back in the morning. My sister and I didn't mention it for years, but we both are absolutely certain grandma stopped by to say goodbye. This happened to me in the past month. For background, I work in a retirement home doing activities. On this day I was filling in at the healthcare center, which is basically hospice. I was in the day room reading stories with one of the ladies. She suddenly asked me who that woman was, while, to me, looked like she was pointing across the room. I don't know, but I'd be happy to ask her so we can find out. I thought she was talking about one of the CNAs who was sitting across the room. No, the woman right next to you. On your left. There was no one sitting next to me. She continued, she looks just like you, but her hair is longer. She says she doesn't have a name. But she's very nice. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, and I must have been giving her a look. Did I say something wrong? No. Nothing's wrong. I made a quick excuse to leave, and practically ran back to my memory care unit. Now here's what shook me up. I was supposed to be an identical twin. But my twin died while we were still in the womb, leaving only me. This is not information I share with the people I work with. One of the CNAs knew from looking at me that something had happened, and wanted to know what it was. She was equally horrified when I told her the story. Phantom whistling that followed a tune at me. My brother and my sister were singing, Green Sleeves, very random lol, while doing dishes in the kitchen one summer. The whistle continued the tune for about 5 seconds after we finished singing and it just dissipated. My sister and I can't whistle and we were all staring at each other while the whistling occurred. My brother and sister immediately checked outside for a passerby. We live in the country, no neighbors, and if there was someone there they would have seen them for sure. Not to mention the whistle was right in the kitchen with us. While I covered my ears and started having a panic attack from fear lol. They checked inside the house for someone too. We couldn't explain it and still talk about to this day. My parents still live there and continue to have odd experiences, but nothing to that level. Edit. We also tried singing in the same spots again to see if there was maybe just an echo, but there was none. When I was in college, I was walking across campus to my early morning class when this old white man with the bluest eyes I've ever seen stopped me to ask for bus ticket money. Everything went still around us. No sounds, the air felt stiff, and there was literally no one but us outside. This man's eyes were like aquamarine. But the rest of his face? It was like his skin was plastered on, his nose looked stuck on like clay, his cheeks looked like they were barely hanging onto whatever was underneath. He looked truly bizarre. He stops me and compliments my lipstick and asks if I could help him pay for a bus ticket so he could visit his son. I told him I didn't have cash to help him. He never breaks eye contact and tells me he's a veteran and takes his wallet out to show me his military lapel. When he opens it I see a wad of cash in there and he looks at me again and asks if I could help. While all of this was happening, the only thing I felt was that I was in danger. I truly thought I was in the presence of someone evil even though he didn't say or do anything to provoke the feeling. I ended up reaching in my bag for quarters and gave them to him. He held my hand for what felt like forever and let me go on my merry way. I think about this encounter a lot because it felt like he was pretending to be human. His skin looked like it was made out of wet clay and wrongly placed. His eyes were so blue they looked unnatural, and why ask for money when you had it already? My father was diagnosed with terminal cancer May 2018. He was given a couple of months to live. My sister was his primary caregiver. I would share some of the responsibility by going over occasionally to help with all sorts of daily routines. My sister was asked to be part of a wedding party. Her best friend since grade school was getting married. She had called to ask for me to make sure my schedule was clear so that she would be able to attend a bridal shower. So I opened up my calendar and marked the date and time. This would have been early June 2018, scheduling for late July 2018. A few weeks after this conversation, my father inevitably had succumbed to his diagnosis and died July 4, 2018 in the afternoon. The following few weeks were non-stop with arrangements and legal matters etc. I was the executor, so I was very busy every day after his passing. One morning I was feeling overwhelmed and needed some time to myself. I had asked my husband to take our daughter out for the day so I could just reflect and nap. I fell asleep on the sofa. I had been sleeping for a little while when I awoke to hearing my father's voice, "Wake up, Dolly," what he called me growing up. It sounded as if he were standing over me. It sent shivers down my spine. I sat up and had this overwhelming urge to grab my phone. When I opened it, my calendar was open, which wasn't beforehand, and it was the same day and time where I had scheduled for my sister's outing a month beforehand to hang with Dad. It always made me question a lot of things. But ultimately I was grateful to have been able to hang with him after all, even with his creepy reminder. Haha, I haven't thought about that in quite some time. Saw an old lady walking in front of me. I walked past her, she smiles at me, I thought she might know me, I smiled back. After maybe 10 seconds, I looked back and she vanished. It was broad daylight and not a very busy road, it goes straight with just one turn which is clearly visible too. It was 10 seconds, no normal person can vanish like that, it was really spooky. Was camping with my wife sitting around the campfire. Started to pour rain, so we went back inside the tent. Inside the tent the rain was so heavy we couldn't hear anything over the pitter-patter hitting the tent. We decide to change our clothes and call it a night. We get into our sleeping bags and turn out the light and hear bleat 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 again, bleat bleat bleat, like the sound Motorola phone would make when the battery was dying. Only thing was we don't have phones that make that sound and our phones are turned off, miles from anyone. Pouring rain. Can't hear if someone is walking up to your tent. Can't tell if someone walked away from your tent. We were trapped inside this canvas death trap with only one exit. We froze and waited for what seemed like hours. Eventually I grabbed my gun and lied and made a dash for the door, trying to get out as fast as I could. Once out I ran around my tent, nothing. No one. Not a sign of life anywhere. We grabbed our valuables and decided to make the 10-minute trek to our car. We made it safe. Drove an hour home. And slept better than we would have if we stayed. The next day we drove back to get our stuff. When we got to our tent it didn't look like anything had been messed with. Nothing out of place. Once we got home and unpacked, my wife couldn't find her underwear. None of them. Literally nothing else was missing from our stuff. It was the wildest and creepiest experience of our life. This happened about 12 years ago. I lived on the first floor of a 2-story building which had all kinds of weird, ghosty crap going on. My crazy landlord had bought heaps of random crap at estate sales and such and was hoarding it in the basement. Which I never went in cause it gave me the creeps. I think all the dead people's junk is why the place was so haunted, but this is my best story. I lived here alone for a year before my boyfriend moved in. We had no pets, and no kids. I told him a few stories and he was skeptical, at best. We shared a king bed, but had separate covers. I had recurring nightmares about a boy, maybe 2 years old, blonde bowl-cut hair, denim overalls but no shirt under and no shoes on him. He would stand on my side of the bed and stare at me, watching me sleep. I'd wake up in a panic and he would vanish. One night, I fell asleep with my feet out of the covers. Boyfriend was sleeping next to me. I feel a very gentle pressure on my left big toe, right where it joins the rest of my foot. I was awake, but absolutely freaked out. It lasted a few minutes and stopped. Eventually I fell back asleep. Over the next month, this happened a few more times. On different feet here and there. I didn't tell my boyfriend, worried he might laugh at me or think I was crazy. Next time it happened, it went on for a good 15 minutes, and I never had the nerve to look down and see WTF was holding my foot. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Hey, please let go of my toe." And slowly, the pressure left and I went back to sleep. I sucked up the courage and told my boyfriend the next day. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. He shrugged and said, "Okay, I know about your nightmares and something is going on. Next time it happens, wake me up and I will look down for you." Okay, great. So a week or two went by with no foot touching. I hoped it was over. Nope. I felt it again. I tapped my boyfriend and he opened his eyes. He was awake. I said, "Boo, he's got my foot. Look down for me?" Boyfriend nodded, but didn't look down. He just stared at me and whispered back, "I feel him, too. And I'm not looking either." From then on, he believed me when crazy SHT happened in that apartment. BTW, we've been married 10 years now. I once saw a homeless man walking toe-to-toe on the curb on a busy street. He heard a truck coming and bolted right in front of it. I saw the truck slam its brakes to avoid hitting the guy, but it wasn't possible because the truck was speeding. I looked away briefly because I didn't want to see the guy on the pavement and grabbed my phone to call 911. The guy wasn't on the pavement. He also wasn't on the other side of the street. He was gone. Edit. This was broad daylight, about 4 p.m. in the middle of summer. The homeless guy looked like a solid body and there wasn't anything ghostly or shadowy about him. Just looked like a normal, real human being. I used to work at a bowling alley/arcade/laser tag place. Apparently someone had died there in the laser tag arena just under a year before I started working there. One night, we closed the arena for a few hours and I had to clean the arena with some other employees. While we were cleaning, both the main lights and the decorative black lights went out and the whole room was pitch dark. I was on the upper level of the arena when one of the guys behind me screamed at the top of his lungs. I saw that he was somehow barely dangling above the safety rail and yanked his arm back before he fell. He was really freaked out, and said that something cold touched his back and pushed him. There have been other occasions where he's been injured or attacked by some unseen force while inside the arena and we all thought it was the ghost of the guy who died. The employee later quit because he was almost seriously injured inside that cursed arena. I was a kid but a teenager, old enough to know that Santa Claus didn't exist. But one Christmas Eve was staying at my uncle's old farmhouse. In the middle of the night, I awoke to the sight of an old man looking exactly like the typical Santa. I was so confused and scared so I just kept my eyes closed and eventually fell back asleep. Told my family about this mysterious Santa visit and to my surprise, no one ridiculed me for thinking I saw Santa. Instead they determined I was old enough to know the truth about the former owner of the farmhouse. He was a real person who was sadly found dead with suspicious conditions. Turns out my uncle had plenty of odd occurrences throughout his time living there. Never anything hurtful or violent but definitely his presence was known. What really sealed the deal was when they showed me a picture of said previous owner, Saul, and what do you know, he had a remarkable resemblance to Santa. R.I.P. Saul. I was at a friend's farm walking down the road, talking to the owner. I told her of a story my brother told me of seeing a large flash when he was there last. We laughed a little. And then there was a huge flash that lit up the whole valley. I saw it as a tunnel. There were 5 of us there that saw it. Yeah, it was a bit odd. This story is from a childhood friend who told me this and it still unnerves me to this day. She was genuinely freaked out and her family even backed up her claims, so here goes. Basically my friend and her family moved into this rental property which my friend said was haunted. It gave everyone an off feeling. Those who visited or stayed over would mention it. I myself experienced this odd feeling of foreboding whenever I went over there and believed in the consensus that the house was haunted. It honestly felt oppressive in the house and you would feel this pitiful dread that is hard to compute into words and was extremely uncomfortable to experience to say the least. Anyway, this particular inexplicable event that is the basis of this post was enough for my friend's family to pack up and stay with relatives until they moved out permanently. On this fateful afternoon my friend had arrived back home from the park and heard an argument taking place in the kitchen between her mom and dad. My friend thought this was odd as both her parents should be at work, so she called out, "Mom?" Before unlocking the front door and going inside, my friend said the house fell instantly silent. An uncanny silence like all the air had been sucked out of the place and felt stifling and wrong. Then her mom said, "Hey friend's name, we are just in here." My friend was just outside the closed kitchen door at this point and froze beyond opening. It was her mother's voice, but there was something off, like the cadence was missing that made it her mother. It sounded flat and unnatural. My friend decided to bolt back out the front door and wait outside until her brother come home, but she said as she turned back to the house she saw her mother peering at her from the lounge room window. But it wasn't her mother. The face was the same, everything was the same, but her face was devoid of anything that made it her mother. There was no recognition on her mother's face, there was no indication that she was looking directly at her daughter, there was no emotion in the expression, nothing. The eyes looked unstaring and utterly blank. My friend screamed and ran down the street to her mother's work and confirmed that she was there all this time and had never been home. Initially my friend's mother reasoned that someone must have broken, but a later investigation proved nothing had been stolen and the back door was locked, as was the front door when my friend came home. No one could rationalize who my friend saw in the window and why it looked so much like her mother, but not fully human, so that was the deciding factor to nope out of there and find somewhere else to live. The landlord of the house denied anything like this happening when they lived there, but did admit tenants didn't stay long, saying there is something was wrong in the house. My friend also told me she was the only one who actually saw anything definitively sinister in the house, but her family said they definitely felt an evil presence there, which ultimately manifested into the doppelganger experience my friend had. Utterly terrifying. Not to me, but I was there at the time it happened. This is probably gonna sound like bullshit, but you can make up your mind about it. I was about 11 and at my mate's pop's farm for my friend's birthday. A weekend full of tree forts, truth or dare and shooting guns. It was sick. At night, me and my friends decided to play hardcore spotlight around the entire farm. This is about 9 acres BTW. My friend, who we'll call Gus, was picked to be the spotter. This meant he had a torch and had to try and find us in the pitch black bush. He counted to 100 seconds while me and my friends, who we will call Lee and Tom, decided to hide in this small dump truck at the far end of the farm. 40 minutes go by, and no sign of any torch or Gus. We are so bored, so we decide to start beeping the horn and singing songs as well as flashing the lights so that he could find us. 15 minutes go by, no Gus. We start to go back to the house, cause we think something might be wrong. We see a light on outside, and Gus is sitting there with tears everywhere. His shirt is wet from them. We think he hurt himself, but he had no marks whatsoever. He is just pale as fuck and panting. We asked what was wrong, and he said he saw a bunyip. A bunyip, BTW, is an Australian bush legend of a creature that lives in swamps and eats people. We laughed our asses off first, thinking he was bullshitting, and went back to the RV we were sleeping in. When I was laying there, I realized that it would be very difficult to pretend to cry so hard and be so pale as Gus was. And Gus wasn't good at acting. Okay, so once when I was about 9 years old, it was late at night, I'm asleep in my room and my younger sister, 8, is asleep down the hall in her room. It's not uncommon for us to run into each other's rooms if we have a nightmare, you know that whole trying to outrun the demons, just run and jump into the other's bed? Well, this night I literally wake up out of a dead sleep, it's dark, the moon is high outside my window, and my sister is standing in my doorway. It's not debatable that it's her height, her stupid haircut, down to the New Kids on the Block oversized t-shirt nightgown from my mom's youth. But she's just standing there. One hand on the doorknob, other hand on the doorframe, staring at me, silent. I look at her for a minute and then kind of annoyed I throw my blanket open. Come on if you're coming in here. She doesn't move, doesn't say anything, she's still staring. And I'm not even creeped out at this point, I'm just annoyed and sleepy and white trash, lol. So I get up to go hit her. I know, it's a garbage pail kid thing to do, but I'm just being honest. Our parents didn't teach us self-regulation, it is what it is. I'm better now, lol. I jump out and stomp over to where she is and stop about arm's length in front of her. She's still silent, still staring. Now I'm a little creeped out. What are you doing? And I swipe at her overhand. She disappears as my hand falls. Like not dissipates into nothing, like straight up is just gone. I look back at my bed. I look in the hallway. Nothing. So now I run to a room down the hall because it's that time. Nightmare time. Zoom jump wrestle into her covers. And when I get there, I notice she is there, thank God, but she's shaking violently. She's having a seizure. So then I go on the full tilt alarm, run to my parents' room, turn all the lights on, yelling that sister is having a seizure. We go to the emergency room and she gets her diagnosis of childhood epilepsy. I also didn't even know what a seizure was when I started yelling about this, which was also weird. I honestly think to this day that she astral projected or something. She found a way to come get me because she was in trouble in her bed. One of my jobs when I was young, 18, was at a Coney Island-style restaurant in my city. The restaurant was open 24/6. We closed at 3 a.m. Sunday morning, reopened at 6 a.m. Monday morning, but stayed open all the time the rest of the week. This particular thing happened at about 2:30 a.m. on a Friday. I was the only waitress on shift and the owner was in the kitchen cooking. We were the only two people there. At the time we had a regular I'll call Jerry. Jerry was a barfly and a senior citizen. He would come in every night after the bar closed. He would have coffee, 2 eggs over easy, and wheat toast. He ordered the same thing every time and every time his total came to $4.37. He'd give me $6 and tell me to keep the change. So as I'm rolling silverware and waiting for our old pal Jerry, I see a few emergency vehicles go down the main street towards the bar. Lights and sirens on. About a minute later Jerry comes in. I get him coffee and ask him if he knows what's going on. He just shook his head no, so I told my boss Jerry was there and my boss waved at him through the kitchen window and within 3 minutes Jerry's order was up. He's sitting at the counter and after a little while he slaps down some money and says keep the change honey like he usually did and walks out. I went over to cash out the check and the food hadn't been touched, neither had the coffee, and there was a $100 bill on the counter. I was a teen mom and perpetually broke, so that much money was basically life-changing at the time. I saw in the paper on Sunday that Jerry had been involved in a fight at the bar that night and had been fatally injured. Last year I had a very intense dream where my ex-boyfriend from 10 years earlier came to me. It was so vivid I could see all of his gray hairs and the pores on his face. He said, "I want you to know that you are very special to me." I mean it. We had a complicated relationship, and he was not very good at expressing emotional stuff. In the dream he had this sort of urgency to tell me this, and it seemed like he was really struggling to make sure I understood. I woke up after he finished talking, and even though it was the middle of the night I was wide awake. I was kind of shaken, but I had recently had a baby, so I wrote it off to weird postpartum hormones and went back to sleep. About 2 weeks later I found out that he died by suicide. I'm an atheist. So was he. I don't believe in ghosts, or telepathy, or any sort of woo. But as much as I try to tell myself logically this was just coincidence. My brother was arrested one night after drunk driving. We figured he was kept in jail overnight since it was his third offense. We found out in the morning he had been released the same night. Well, he went missing. We started searching for him the next morning and afternoon. I was the passenger in a vehicle and suddenly my whole entire body went numb, couldn't move, speak, etc. for about 2 full minutes. When I was finally able to talk again I told the person I was driving with I wanted to go back home. 5 minutes after getting home my brother and the cop he had been out with came back and told us my brother's body had been found. He had committed suicide. My body and brain just knew. My brother had also had a dream that night that our brother came up behind him, gave him a hug, and said it's going to be okay. The 3-story house that I grew up in was built in 1965. My parents purchased the home in 1997 right before I started first grade. My parents, sister, and I lived upstairs while my grandma lived on the second floor by herself. My grandma would babysit me while my parents were at work, so she would walk upstairs at least twice a day to check on me. My grandma would always wear these slippers that were very heavy, so it was easy to hear her footsteps even from downstairs. It must have been a Saturday or Sunday since I did not have school. I was by myself upstairs, alone in my room, playing with my Game Boy, sitting with my back facing my bedroom door. I heard the unmistakable sound of my grandma walking up the stairs to check on me. I heard her proceed up the stairs, walk down the hallway, and stop in front of my door. I felt like she was about to say something, so I looked over to meet her gaze. But there was no one standing there. I instantly felt startled and ran out of my room to check the hallway and stairs. No one else was upstairs besides me. I found my grandma downstairs sitting on the couch watching television. When I was 17 or so I took my dog outside to piss and there was a large humanoid figure walking into the woods. It was sunset, so at first I thought maybe shadows in the tree line, but the hair stood up on my dog's back like I've never seen and she growled at it, didn't bark. I was kind of frozen a bit in fear but also just confusion at what I was looking at. The neighborhood speed sign was near it for reference, so I would say this thing was at least 10 feet tall. Long and lanky legs and arms, thick black fur. It didn't look in my direction, just a gentle stride right into the woods. I went back inside immediately and told my parents, and they remember me doing this as well. It was in Missouri, an hour south of St. Louis. Obviously thoughts of Bigfoot, or apparently there is a monster called Momo. I have no idea what that was. I used to be a ghost tour guide in Colonial Williamsburg. One night shortly after the holidays, I was leading an extended 10 p.m. tour. We got to one of the stops and I was telling the stories about the history of the location and the activity there while a few people took pictures. After I was done talking, everyone broke off to take pictures and go see the little family cemetery when one of my guests came up to me with her phone and said, "I think you should see this." It was a picture of me, and standing at my right shoulder was a large black figure with a smile I can only describe as demonic. I had never cussed at work before, but before I could stop myself, I said oh shit. Then I checked to make sure there were no kids in the vicinity. Naturally, though, everyone else on the tour had to come see. We moved on pretty quickly after that. Lots. But here's the most inexplicable. Sometime back in the early 90s, my then girlfriend and I lived in a Victorian terraced house. Nothing overtly spooky ever occurred there, apart from the neighbors complaining that someone had been in their house and moved things around when they were away. They were alarmed enough to call the police, and seeing as there was a shared roof space along the terrace, we were briefly questioned, as were the other neighbors. Weirdly, the police asked if there had been any paranormal activity in either of our houses, which was obviously laughed off. At the time, a few months later, my girlfriend and I were lying in bed with the lights out. I was on my back with my eyes open. Slowly, a luminescent, hollow ball faded into view, seemingly made up of lots of very small, dim fluorescent rods, like the magnified pictures of bacteria you see. The ball was about 1 meter across and was perhaps 1.5 meters above the middle of the bed. I was obviously having some pre-sleep hallucination. After a few seconds it faded and I turned to my girlfriend and said I just saw a ball of small lights floating over the bed. She had seen it too. We lay there, shocked. Soon, another hollow ball appeared, this time made up of dim, fluorescent triangles. Again, this lasted a few seconds then faded away. I think after that, eyes were tightly shut and heads went under the duvet, but the experience was never repeated, as far as either of us saw. I told this story to somebody once and they wondered what would have happened if we'd reached up to the strange objects. So my parents are currently remodeling the kitchen and tore down the walls. The workers found about 10 balled-up newspapers in between the walls. My dad works from home and was there, as the workers talked about how, a long time ago, cheap-ass people would attempt to use this as insulation. My dad straightened out the newspapers one by one, curious what year they were from. The papers were all dated 1980, which would make sense because my parents didn't buy the house until 1983. But one newspaper was dated 2006. There are 0 reasons for this finding. My parents have never taken down the walls before and they were sealed, as walls are. This house has many haunted stories, but since I moved out like 16 years ago, I haven't heard anything new until this event last week. When I was in college, a guy started chatting me up in the on-campus Starbucks. He walked me to my class and then got disoriented and said, "For some reason I can't remember where the business building is," so I gave him directions. When I went to look him up on Facebook that evening, I found a memorial group for him. He was a student at my college who died in a car wreck before I even attended. Not sure why his ghost was lingering on campus, but I hope he made it across before too long. I never saw him again. When I was 6, my mom was driving my 3 siblings and me somewhere home during rush hour traffic. She ran out of gas on a major highway. We panicked for a while. My siblings were freaking out. This was 20 years ago. After about 10 minutes or so, my mom's brick phone had died and we're basically stranded, in rush hour with 4 kids in a major highway. Eventually someone stops. I remember it so clearly. He was this tall black man with a white beard and white hair, wearing a white suit, driving a big cream-looking Lincoln-type car. He had RBI's incredibly calm demeanor. He pulls a gas tank out of his back seat that has virtually nothing else in it beside the gas can and said he'd be back in 10 minutes. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, by some miracle, this guy drives through the grassy median plus crossed 4 lanes of rush hour traffic going 70 miles per hour with the gas. My mom asked for his phone number to repay him and send a thank you note, and he gave us his business card. He was a pastor at a church. A couple days later, my mom looked into it, called the number which was disconnected. She called around in the area it was supposedly located in, and residents said they'd never heard of it. The church basically didn't exist. To this day, every time I retell it I get chills. I'd kiff it was a guardian angel, but it's always been a very weird and unexplainable event that gives me a weird vibe when I recall it. This didn't happen to me, but it happened to my mom's friend. One day the friend and her sister were driving on a freeway, and I don't remember how this happened, but the car crashed and flipped, rolled over 5 lanes. My mom's friend was the only one conscious and she was trapped under the steering wheel and her sister's head was bleeding really bad. She said a normal-looking man wearing white appeared out of nowhere and came up to them and took off his shirt to wrap the sister's head, and then he left. When the paramedics arrived, they asked who wrapped the sister's head and she told them. The paramedics asked where he went and she pointed to the direction he walked. The paramedics said they had just come from that direction and no one was on the road for miles. They also said that he wrapped her head in such a perfect way that she would have bled out and died if he hadn't done that. No one believes me, but this happened to me about 3 years ago. I live in Central TX, and my bedroom faces a field where there are usually 2 to 3 cows. When the weather is nice, I tend to keep my bedroom window cracked to get some cooler air in. One house next to me had been vacant for years, and the other was a friend, an older woman with no small children. I was laying in bed, and heard a little girl outside say, "Come outside, please." Okay, I thought maybe it was dream, but I was wide awake at that point. About 3 minutes later, the same voice, "Please come outside." I closed and locked my window. Needless to say, was actually just talking about this the other day. When I was a senior in high school, my dad drove me across state, in New Mexico, USA, to check out a college I was thinking of going to. We were in the middle of nowhere in the desert and we needed gas. We saw a small station and pulled into it. There was a note taped to the pump that said "See cashier for payment." There was one car parked on the side of the building and it didn't look like it had been there long at all. No dust on it, tire marks and the dirt still visible, newish model, but we didn't see a single person. We walked up the building and the door was locked. You could see all the merchandise was still boxed up and the shelves were empty. There was a door in the back that had a deep freeze pushed in front of it as if someone was trying to keep something, or someone, from being able to open it. It was so quiet and airy. I looked at my dad and he looked at me and we quickly got back into the car and got the hell out of there. To this day I always wonder if someone was put in that back room and left for dead. Should we have called someone and reported it? Probably. I think about it all the time. Could I have saved someone's life if I had called? Were they already dead? Was anyone even there, or was it just an eerie coincidence that the freezer was positioned in that way? I don't know, but man, I do know that in that moment I felt actual fear, and I think my dad did too. A feeling of you need to leave now or something bad will happen. Shortly after my mother-in-law died, my husband was in our kitchen in the early morning hours, 6 to 6:30 a.m. I was upstairs getting the kids ready for school. I heard a loud noise and ran downstairs to check if he was okay. He was standing there with a shocked look on his face and I saw my cookbooks and recipes all over the floor. They were kept in a cabinet above the countertop, he said. Those literally just flew out of the cabinet. I was like, WTF? He had been standing making lunches at least 6 feet from the cabinet and he said the cabinet opened and the books and recipes flew out, not dropped to the counter. Flew across the kitchen floor. Here is where it gets crazy. There was one recipe all alone on the floor with nothing else around it. It was his mom's recipe for cheesecake, which was his absolute favorite thing she ever made. She had handwritten it for me shortly before she died, so I could continue to make it for him. So, I said to my husband, "I guess I better make you a cheesecake soon." She was a very funny lady, so I can totally see her doing this from the beyond. If I had not seen this with my own eyes, I would have never believed it. A few years ago, 3 friends and I went on vacation to a resort. On the 3rd or 4th night we all felt a little too tired to go out for drinks and decided to crash early that night. I shared a room with one friend and our 2 other friends shared another room on a different floor. As I was laying in bed, feeling like I'm about to go to sleep, I turn over in my bed and see that my friend is walking around the room. I thought that perhaps he was texting his girlfriend and is just restless. He moves out of my eyeline and I feel my bed sink. I think to myself, is he putting on shoes? And on my bed. Whatever, I'm tired, I'm gonna go to sleep. The next morning as we are all eating breakfast, I ask him where he went last night. He replies, "What do you mean?" I didn't go anywhere. I ask him why he was walking around the room. He says he thought that was me walking around. No one else had a key card to our room, and we both saw someone walking around our room. I work at Taco Bell and had this co-worker I'll call Terrence. Terrence was a rather extroverted guy, always fist bumping and trying to be everybody's friend and such. Gave off no weird vibes at all for the small time I knew him. He always was nice and willing to help and never seemed to slack off. When he was employed, he never told me to take his shift like other coworkers did so they can mess around. I then heard Terrence has been terminated for jumping on cars at the Taco Bell he previously worked at. After a few months talking to my managers and co-workers, apparently everybody caught the crazy vibe of Terrence being off except for me. One even said he would beat his ass if he ever stepped foot here again. especially after one of my female co-workers saw him dancing like a demon then stopped when he noticed her. It's unexplainable since literally everybody but me didn't like him and noticed he was a bad hire except me, and I am known for being able to sniff out weirdos and shady people. It's not shake me to my core spooky or paranormal, but I am so shocked how blind I was to someone so unhinged and how obvious it was to everybody around me. My unexplained story involves my old dog who passed a few years ago. I adopted her from a shelter when she was already 10. She was there because her previous owner had passed unexpectedly. When I received her medical records, it was very clear that her previous owner had loved her very much and taken excellent care of her. Over my 6 or so years owning her, several spooky things happened that spanned different apartments and cities, but always when she was there. The most notable was when she and I were visiting my then boyfriend in a different town. We were all getting ready for bed, so all the lights had just been turned off, and I was near the patio door that opened to the parking lot. I bent over to pick something up and I hear something whiz past my head, softly thunk against the glass, and rustle all the blinds. My immediate thought was that my boyfriend was messing with me and had thrown some balled-up socks at me. I stand up and prepare to tell him off a little, but through the light coming from the parking lot I can see he's frozen and his eyes are as big as saucers. He heard the same things and saw the blinds start to move, so we turned the lights on to investigate and find no evidence of anything that could have made the noise, and nothing disturbed despite the still swinging blinds. I was about 7 feet from the door and he and my little old gal were about 10 to 15 feet away. We never came up with an explanation, but I like to think her previous owner was keeping an eye out to make sure I was taking good care of her. Sitting at the desk in my basement at my house during college, I saw a ball of light the size of a basketball manifest across the room from me, fly towards me, then veer off and disappear. It was the middle of a clear, sunny day. Not sure, but given it's the only time something like that has ever happened to me, I would classify it as abnormal, maybe even paranormal. Also, immediately after, it was like I could see the air flowing in the room. This happened when I was in high school in southern Michigan, probably 2003 to 2004. I had spent the evening with my girlfriend at her house and was driving home late, between 11 p.m. and midnight. My car was low on gas, and the gas station in the nearby village was already closed, so I decided to go a little out of the way to a 24-truck stop, gas station along the highway to fill up the tank. Usually I would follow the direct route back to my family's house, out in the countryside, from the village, but it's easier to take an alternate route back from this truck stop, so that's what I decided to do. This was a pitch black night, probably a new moon or heavily overcast. I was driving down this country road and approaching a T intersection indicated by a large yellow yield sign on the right side of the road. People see these road signs every day, so everyone has a pretty good idea about how big and tall they are. About a yard wide and 7 to 8 feet off the ground. As I got closer to the sign, I saw a large, low, dark-shaped dash across the road from left to right just out of the range of my headlights. Naturally, I slowed down, being used to seeing deer on the road. But it quickly became clear that this thing was no animal I'd ever seen before. Once it had reached the right side of the road, it reared up and stood on its hind legs right in front of the yield sign, almost completely obscuring the sign itself. It was covered in jet black hair so dark that I couldn't make out any details except the broad shoulders and reflective pale eyes. Safe to say I noped right out of there as fast as I could. Whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. It gives me chills to this day when I recall the event, and I really try not to think about it when I have to leave my car to open the gate at the end of my family's driveway, or when I sometimes have to help tend to the horses late in the evening. I can't say this is completely unexplainable, because since reaching adulthood I've realized that I've suffered from sleep paralysis since I was a child, and the likely explanation for what happened is directly connected to that. But it was absolutely terrifying nonetheless. I was 13 years old at the time and living with my mom and stepdad in their 250-ish-year-old house. I had fallen asleep in the basement, but just to be clear, it's not what you're picturing. Their basement, while eerie, had a couple of big couches and a large TV. Definitely a leisure room. I woke up at one point in the middle of the night and couldn't move at all. My entire body was frozen except for my eyes, which were frantically flying around. Again, I know now this is standard sleep paralysis and I've had it happen more times than I can count throughout my life. But here's where it got much worse than usual. Their house was an old townhome in the city. Narrow and very long, extending back. So I'm there on the couch in the middle of the night, completely frozen and unable to move, which is terrifying enough and horribly unsettling. And then down the hallway toward the back of the house is very dark because my mom had turned off that quarter light. I could barely make out the back stairs, and I saw a figure walking toward me. A woman, middle-aged at most, walking slowly directly at me. Her face was obscured by the shadows and I could only make out the faintest linen pants and blouse. Next thing I knew, I felt hands closing around my throat, choking me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream out loud, but I was screaming in my head for what felt like an hour. Suddenly I could feel my limbs again and shot up on the couch. Not 5 seconds later I was sprinting upstairs to my bedroom, too afraid to look behind me. Never went back to that basement alone until I was an adult, and even then, it always creeped me out. I had what I called a black hole dream series. In the dreams I was always in control, but as soon as I mentioned it, or even thought it, I'd be snapped into a different reality or place. For example, to most recent one I remember, in the dream, I woke up in a forest and wandered around singing something, but I couldn't remember what I was singing. Then I stopped and said, "Where am I going? I shouldn't be here." Then I snapped into my bedroom that I was currently sleeping in, sat up, then a pair of hands pushed me down by the chest and then I woke up. It's really creepy and odd. When I was a baby, my parents used to put me down to sleep in a standard-sized cot in the front room. No point putting me out of sight upstairs. Back in the day when everyone left their doors open, she walked in to check on me from doing her chores more than a few times to find my cot surrounded by attentive guarding dogs. We didn't have a dog. All the neighborhood dogs, including my aunts from half a mile away, would sneak in and congregate around my cot. No fighting. I bought an older house from a friend. It was his mom's and I bought it when she moved on to another reality. She was a practicing Wiccan and an amazing artist, especially working with clay. She made all the tiles for my hearth and all the pulls on the drawers and cabinets. She was an awesome lady. When we were just getting ready to move in, we were going there every day to clean, having floors laid, etc. Every morning we would go to the house, that we made sure was locked up tight when we left the night before, and all the lights and fans would be on in every room and all the doors open. We changed the locks, same thing. We put locks on every window and sliding glass doors. Kept happening. We took out the doggy drawer thinking someone was reaching through to unlock the door. No change. Finally I just called out to the empty house, called her by name, and asked her to please stop. It didn't, but it happened a lot less. My dog sitter won't stay alone anymore because he kept seeing shadows. The weirdest thing is, my dog started digging up little clay figures. We had 30 or 40 of them. My friend told me to bury them back. We did and things seemed to be better. Very weird. I've told only a few people of this and posted once in a glitch group, which I'd if you can call it a glitch, paranormal or just unexplained, but here it is. I've always dreamt very vividly and had small things I've dreamt of actually happen months or years later, but nothing as big as this. I have had this recurring dream since I was about 6 or so up until I was in my mid-20s, now 38. But I dreamt about seeing myself as a little girl, was always an adult in my dreams, on a carousel and waving to myself and being so happy. I was wearing a romper that were popular attire in the 80s for little girls, and became popular again within the past 5 years or so, and a pair of sandals. I always wondered why I would dream of this, like maybe something traumatic happened and my brain was trying to remember or some SHT, but turned out to be quite the opposite. So fast forward to 2018, I was at a fair with my family and my BF took our daughter, 2.5, on the carousel as I waited taking pics being so giddy and happy. I had miscarried 1.5 years before getting pregnant with her and it was really hard on my mental health. I didn't realize it at the time until I was going through the pics later on that it was the dream I had off and on for years. It was my future daughter I was seeing in my dreams all along, not myself. Same outfit and shoes, same overwhelmingly happy feeling for just a regular day at the fair. Everything was just the same. I cried just thinking about it. I know some people don't believe me, but it's a magical thing that I experienced, and I pull up the photo of her from that day from time to time and just am in complete shock over it to this day. What a wild and cool thing to experience. So one thing you need to know about me for this story, is that I did not believe in the supernatural. I enjoyed and still do, listening to the stories, and things of the liking, but I just didn't believe in it. This story takes place about 4 or 5 years ago. I was living on a farm that had pigs, chickens and cats and dogs. The pigs had a pen that was about 25 by 30 and it was built from wire and planks. The planks, they would regularly rub against and make loud noises with. The wire would scrape against the wood and make loud noise. The pigs would snort and splash in mud. In short, it was always loud there. I was walking around after a long day of work with my older brother and ma. It was about 10:30, middle of December, so it was cold and the sun was down, and I heard a loud noise, similar to one of the pigs screaming, come out of the valley that the pig's pen was located in. I ignored it, because as stated earlier, it was always loud there, but after about 3 minutes of the non-stop screaming of the pigs, I decided that something was wrong and I needed to check it out, so I dreadfully trudged downwards into the valley on the worn path, and lo and behold, nothing was wrong. At least that was what I had thought. See, our ma had given us headlamps that we were required to wear when we were outside after 9. See, we lived in Kentucky, specifically a part that lived up to the name Coyote Country, so you can understand why she required it. After I turned on my lamp, I immediately saw what their squealing was for. Before me stood a creature. It stood on all fours, but it looked weirdly humanoid. It couldn't be human though, because its arms were too long. It had a snout, and wolf's ears. Its mouth was covered in blood. Its teeth were razor sharp, and its eyes reflected an eerie white against my headlamp. It was covered in fur, and abnormally tall for a coyote, or even a bobcat. Before it, sat the carcass of the pig. I won't go into the gruesome details of what had been done to it, but imagine a butcher shop, but only if the animals were still alive and squealing around. I screamed, yes, literally screamed, and ran away in terror, tripping along the way because I wore cowboy boots back then, the kind with heels. I ran all the way back to the cabin, which was 4 acres away, and explained what had happened to my brother and ma. My brother didn't believe me, but my ma was concerned and sent him out to check it. He came back saying that the pen was broken and that one of the pigs were missing. When I went to check, it was true. Of course, there was a blood spot where the carcass had been, but the creature was gone. All of the piglets were huddled in a corner together, refusing to leave. So we spent 2 hours fixing the pen. Then we went back and everyone laid down. It had been a long time since then, and I still don't know what I saw. For a while I thought I was insane, but now I know it happened. I believe in the supernatural. We moved soon after that. Does anyone know what I saw? When I was 10, I was going through a lot of terrible stuff and was processing trauma, so who knows if this was a hallucination or trauma response to what was happening or something like that, but whatever it was, it messed me up. I was in my room after something really bad happened and I was crying really hard into my blanket, when this weird pounding sound started on my roof. I had a second attic since I slept upstairs and you could easily access it. There were also windows onto my room in my old house so I could look out to see the street. It was kinda a light tapping. It was repetitive and was enough to get me up, and I refused to open my door. I was honestly scared to look in the hallway. I checked out the window and saw nothing but still heard that tapping, and it was slowly almost building. It was horrifying. Something started banging on the door and I fell asleep crying. I went to my mom that morning and asked if she heard anything that night. I still wonder what happened. I have 2, both involving the same sort of root cause. My best friend of my whole life, and my only friend for a good chunk of my life, died about a week before we found out my then girlfriend was pregnant. I still hadn't graduated college due to a requirement that was overlooked by both myself and my counselor. I had started working full-time to help take care of my son before he was born, so my days were non-stop. Wake up at 4:30 a.m., get to work by 5:30, work until noon or so, drive back home to shower really quickly, leave for school, get to school, depending, about 40 minutes minus 1 hour later, go to class, leave school around 9 p.m., go home, do whatever homework and sleep. I did this for months, and one day I was hitting my limit. I was so tired. If I could only do one of these sets of things, then I would have so much more energy to hang out with my son, be a good boyfriend to my girlfriend, help out more around where we stayed. I worked Sunday through Thursday, and one Thursday after I had come home and didn't have a class afterward, I was laying down with my son. I had homework due the next day, and I was about half done with it. I was laying there, eyes closed, no one in the room but my son and I. Then a steady series of very hard and loud taps on my window woke me from my quasi-sleep. Sometimes when the neighbors were watering some plants they would hit my window with it, and it sounded almost like that, but the window was dry. I thought maybe it was my father-in-law knocking on my window to say hi to the baby. I opened the door from my room to see everyone else who lives in the house in the living/dining room. I closed the door again. Right before the knocking I said, in my own head, "Hey V." My friend's full name was long, so I called him V. "I think I'm just gonna drop out." Once I realized there was no other cause I could figure out, I sighed, said "Message received bro," and grabbed out my homework. The other takes place about a month or so after my son was born, roughly 10 months after my brother's death. I'm still reeling from it, and I'm reeling from being a father. I was randomly out at a park near my house. It was obviously my son's first birthday. He was stumbling around, being one, whatever. To my right I hear my brother's voice, "Hey guys, sorry I'm late." Nipote equals nephew in Italian. My head shot over to the sound, and there he was. I was so excited and shocked I just went and tackled him straight to the ground, hugging him and crying. My mom, sister, and everyone else also came over to him. I was so happy. He wasn't dead. Then it hit me. The sky had no color. Everything felt washed in the brush of a dream. I stopped, looked at him and went, "You died." Previously he was laughing with everyone else. He tried ignoring me, like a dog that knows it's done something it shouldn't. "You died." The rest of the party stopped. "You died. Didn't you?" He looked away from me, defeated. He said yeah. And it hung in the air. My dream paused, almost as if you could hit a stopwatch to reality. With everyone else frozen, he hugged me and said, "I love you man. Tell everyone else I love them too." He vanished, and I woke up crying. I'm too late and no one will read this, but it's true. I was maybe 5? I got up super early one morning and ran to my parents' room to finish sleeping with them, normal little kid stuff. The next morning we all recounted the exact same dream, 3 ghosts at the foot of the bed with ZZ Top beards. None of us were afraid, we felt protected. My parents are super no nonsense but we all still talk about the ZZ Top guys having our backs. When I was in Canada on my winter break a few years back, my parents rent a nice house for 2 weeks. Every night when I was in my bed and switched the lights off, I would start hearing a really wacky and somehow terrifying noise from outside, from the closed window that was right above my bed. It turned out that it was a huge elk that would come to my window every night and start licking it. I couldn't stop looking and was really scared. Couldn't sleep for a week because the elk wouldn't let me. When I was about 12 or 13 I was walking home from a friend's house after school and passed by a girl that appeared to be slightly younger than I was. She was soaking wet and looked seriously upset, so I asked her what was wrong and she ignored me. Didn't think anything of it. Got home to my father warning me about going near the lakes I was walking by because a 10-year-old girl drowned in one of them the day before. The first of many ghosts that have made their presence known to me. I was playing with a stick in the backyard and told myself I could beat the devil's ass with my stick sword. I was 7 at the time. Then out of the random junk in the backyard an arm started stretching out and groaning started. It was mumbling something and sounded like the voice of a really old person in pain. Since I wasn't a complete idiot by 7 years old standards I ran into the house as quickly as I could. Turns out the bookshelf was from a yard sale of someone who died. The arm manifesting itself was the same at the bookshelf. My parents being superstitious Hispanics took that bookshelf to the dump. Not allowing that negative juju into our home, they then said a rosary for a week and sprinkled holy water in the backyard. It never happened again. My parents, knowing I wasn't a liar, thankfully believed me. What happened made no sense, but I'm sure it was tied to the passing of the person. I'm sure if I stayed to see what came out / fully manifested I probably wouldn't be around today. About 20 years ago, I had just gotten off the train with my friend and we were exiting the station up the stairs and walking home. I glanced across the road, and there was this guy standing rigid just glaring at us. Didn't know him, had no idea who he was. He was in a long coat and had dark scruffy hair. His head swiveled to watch us walk past, still staring, kinda mentally went WTF, and then kept chatting to my mate. Went on a few more steps and glanced backwards. The man was crossing the road at a diagonal, heading our way. He was about 150 meters away. I picked up the pace a bit, but didn't say anything to my friend, 'cause it just felt a bit stupid to be creeped out. A couple more steps and looked back, and this guy is running at us, sort of crouched down and his arms extended in front of him with hands clawed. My mate has noticed too by this time, and we start running. As we get another 50 meters or so, a passenger walks up the same stairway from the station, crosses the footpath in between us and the man, and heads across the road to a laneway on the other side. The crazy man veers after him at the last second. We don't look back anymore. Our house is only a block away and we pelt home. As we're almost in our front gate, we heard a scream. Tore up the front steps, fell through the front door, and locked it behind us. I checked the news for a week afterwards, but there was nothing. Never saw the guy again. It's the most absolute animal panic I've ever felt in my life. One evening, a little while after sunset, a woman was walking her small dog down the street, in front of my house. Trailing them by about 20 to 30 yards was a mid-sized jet black animal I had never seen before. Looked like a coyote or a large fox. Apparently black coyotes and foxes do exist. This animal followed them for probably a minute. The woman didn't notice, or if she did, she was unfazed. Looking out the window I started to worry that this animal was about to jump the dog and eat it. The dog was so small that it definitely could have. But after a little bit the animal turned around, stood in the road for a while, then went back into the woods. Well, when I was 16 my family was temporarily staying at my aunt's house while we transitioned from out of state to the area. My aunt lived in an old family house that had been in our family for generations. The house was super old, everything was made out of real wood, and creaked like hell, doors, windows, stairs, floors. It was summertime, and me being 16, I was up around 2 a.m. in the living room chilling by myself on my laptop. All the lights were out because I didn't want to disturb anyone else in the house. The house had the basic main floor, upstairs, and basement. It was also an old row house in DC so you could just turn your head in either direction and see the entirety of the house, so it wasn't the largest of spaces. Well anyway, I'm chilling, hanging out, super attentive to whatever the hell I was looking at on my computer. I was laying on my tummy with my head in the direction of the front door and stairwell that lead upstairs. Then out of nowhere I hear someone say my name from right behind me. I mean right behind me, as if someone was standing or sitting right behind me. The voice was crystal clear, not a muffle or anything. It sounded like a man's voice although there were no men in the house. I also have an extremely unique name that isn't easily confused with other words. Instantly I smiled thinking it was one of my sisters or cousin playing a prank on me. I whipped my head around to catch whoever thought they were funny and there was absolutely no one there. As I began to think of how someone could be pranking me, the humorous feeling I had quickly faded to terribly petrified. I realized I was the only one on the main floor. Everyone else was either upstairs in the bedrooms, or my mom was sleeping in the basement turned temporary room. I began thinking that the proximity the voice came from, literally right behind me, was too close for someone to sneak up behind me to not hear them approaching. Literally everything in this house creaked loud as hell, literally impossible for someone to even tiptoe around without being heard. Before this moment I was facing the staircase, so if anyone came downstairs from one of the upstairs bedrooms I would have seen them. Within a matter of seconds I hopped up and went off to the basement to join my mom as she slept. One of the most horrifying moments of my life. Never experienced anything remotely similar since. Thank God. I lived in a house that was a party house before I moved in. My roommate's best friend, who also lived there, died in the front yard while saving someone that was having a suicidal moment in the highway. Flash forward several years and I'm bouncing his basketball on the front porch as my roommate is loading some stuff in his car to move for the college semester. At some point the ball ends up in the bushes by the door. I say my goodbyes, he leaves and I go inside. A few hours later I walked into the kitchen and the basketball is on the island. I froze in the doorway for several seconds. This basketball has never been inside the house in all the 4 years that I lived here. Still gives me chills anytime I think about it. R.I.P. Clark. Working at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin. That place is known to be haunted. Whatever, I don't believe in that ish. It was a very busy night. I was moving some bags to a customer's room. I was using the hidden corridor to get access to a service elevator. As I approach the elevator, it opens on its own. I wait a moment for someone to get out. No one does, it's empty. I lug the bags into the elevator and the door closes and then starts moving on its own. I have not pressed any buttons. It stops in the floor I need. I poked my head out and no one is there. I step out with the bags and say thanks to the elevator and it shuts and goes back down. Another time, I had just finished setting up the mezzanine for a party the next day. I'm downstairs now but I hear some ruckus up on the mezzanine. Sounds like a couple kids playing with a ball. I go up to shoo them away, but as I ascend the stairs and turn to face the setup, the sounds stop. No one is there. I look around to see if the kids are hiding somewhere. No kids. I go back downstairs and tell the concierge about what I experienced. He just looks at me and says, "Yeah. This place is haunted." I used to teach in the evenings in Japan about 5 years ago. I often met students at different temples and shrines because people often use the rooms there as community spaces for things like that. It was around 11:30 p.m. I had just had my last English lesson with a student. After she left, it was my job to vacuum the room I had used and turn off all of the lights, so I went into the room with a vacuum and there were dozens of decorated drums and portable shrines I had never seen before that were being stored there as a festival was coming up. I opened the door and could see them moving a little, but I figured it was from vibrations from me opening the sliding door and went about my business. I usually try not to think about creepy things and just ignore if something like this happens. Anyway, I turned out all the lights before bringing back the vacuum, except the last one by the entrance, then went to the storage room again to put the vacuum back. As I opened the door to the storage room, the big drums started booming in rhythm super loud and the portable shrines were all making noise too with the little drums on them. My senses became overwhelmed and I was afraid to look. I fled from the building and ran to my car, only to remember I hadn't locked up. I didn't want to be fired, so I had to call my husband and was on speakerphone with him the entire time that I ran back to the temple and locked the door with shaking fingers, and I could still hear the drums from outside. Luckily I made it out alright, but I feel like something was messing with me, haha. Since then, people asked me if I ever saw any ghosts at the temples because in Japan they believe ghosts come out at temples at night, but I never told them about that and just said no. I am pretty sure it wasn't an earthquake or something that caused it because the drums were making a noise as if someone was hitting them rather than just rattling, and also I didn't feel an earthquake and also it continued longer than an earthquake that you can't feel would normally last. I also felt like it was specifically related to me opening the door and coming into the room, like the first few rattles were a warning but it got real when I went back in and it super needed me to go lol. Early this past August, I was thinking of my dad's upcoming second anniversary since his death. One night I went out to my car and in the corner of my eye, saw the barn light turn off for a second or two. This barn light was kind of tucked behind a shed, not in direct line of the driveway. Rummaging through my car, I looked up and saw the light turn on again for a moment, gathered my things and once again, I saw the barn light turn on for a moment. I turned towards the barn, looking into the darkness and I said out loud, "If that is you, my father, turn the light on." The light turned on and stayed on for a solid minute. I could almost feel him standing there. Once the light turned off, I stepped forward to see the barn door was closed, the animals were locked up. The following night I tried setting off the barn light from where I had stood and couldn't. The previous owner of our house knocked on the door at like 9/10 p.m. asking if we'd had any paranormal experiences in the house. It was pretty creepy. But I did see an apparition resembling my late dog a while after his visit. ETA bonus story I just remembered, at a different house we came home one day to the door wide open. Nothing missing, but the answering machine was blaring screeching noises and sounded almost demonic. Super scary. I saw my grandma kill a snake with magic when I was a kid. She sprinkled something on it and it shriveled up and its eyes got big like a cartoon. Kind of like Large Marge in the Pee Wee Herman movie. It dried up into a worm-like spot and stayed in the front yard for years. When I was probably 14 to 15 I woke up late around 1 to 2 a.m. and left my room and looked out the front window. I saw a bright light aim towards my house but it was probably 1-2 miles away. It was coming from the sky but at a distance, not above, so it was flying low. I watched as it got closer. The light never broke its position aimed at my house. As it got closer I ran to my room at the opposite side of the house and looked outside my window and a giant rectangular-shaped flying object flew overhead without making a sound. It was probably 300 feet wide and 500 feet long. The surface looked Star Wars-like. Think of the surface of a Death Star with random outcrops and lights. I think it knew I was watching because that same light was still aimed at my window. It just steadily kept flying away until it was out of sight. Maybe a year ago I was out for a run and stopped at a light waiting to cross. An old VW Bug pulls up to make a right turn. As it was stopped for a few seconds, I noticed there was an old lady in the front passenger seat looking at me and smiling. I swear she looked exactly like my grandma who died about 17 years ago. She didn't wave or anything, but she was looking right at me through the closed window and definitely smiling. I didn't notice who was driving or much else about the car. It made the turn and nothing else happened. Not that weird a story, I guess, and I'm sure it was just someone who looked like her. But I really felt like I'd seen a ghost for the rest of the day. I had a legitimate near-death experience. Tunnel of light and the whole bit. I was electrically shocked from the back of a TV. The back of the old-style TV is a tube, and that tube is basically a huge capacitor that holds more volts than an electric chair. I miraculously survived with only a heart arrhythmia. My grandpa, who worked for a local power company, told my mom later that I shouldn't be alive how I got shocked. In my near-death experience, I walked down the tunnel and there was a bright light. The light asked what I was doing there. I panicked because I'm like, if I don't know, then I don't know. And then the light said I had a job to do and sent me back. The light faded, and where it faded my mom came into view. She was a retired RN, so she was trying to find a pulse or a blood pressure. In her words, I was gone for solid couple minutes. My heart just kind of kickstarted again. It is comforting though. Whenever I was, it was peaceful, and it was alluded that my ticket at road and I was going to be there someday. Like, no question. No, you need to fix this thing in your life. What also stood out to me is that my sexuality wasn't an issue. I'm bisexual, but at the time this all happened, I was 14 and still figuring things out. If it comforts anyone, it clearly was a total non-issue. I had an imaginary friend as a child who I would only ever see at my cottage. This friend didn't speak and was very pale. One day he asked me if I wanted to meet his family, and if I wanted to go home with him. Again, he never spoke, but he conveyed this wish to me. I was very excited since I didn't know where he lived and had never met his family, so off we went further into the woods until we reached a place where a woman wearing white was standing, and my friend indicated to me that I should follow them. Just then, I heard my mother calling me. I told my friend I had to leave but that I would be right back, and he got very upset with me, insisting that I go with him and return later. My mother called me again, and I apologized to my friend, who at this point was sadder than I'd ever seen him. I ran home to the cottage where my mom was busy weeding. I asked my mom why she had called me, and she informed me that she had not called me at all. I ran back to the spot I last saw my friend, but he wasn't there, nor was he in any of our usual spots. He disappeared, and I never saw him again. The whole experience was strange, but I just want to know who called me that day in the woods. This is going to sound really innocuous and silly, but it's bothered for the last 20 or so years. When I was a little kid, like maybe between 3 and 5, I saw a black object move across the end of our driveway, from one side of the flower bed to disappear into the flowers on the other side. It was this perfectly round, pure black thing, like a soot sprite sort of, and just flat black. At the time I assumed it was some animal I didn't know yet, but it was like it wasn't three-dimensional. This was about 20 years ago and I still think about it. I have several, but this is the one that first came into my mind. When I was 6 years old, we moved next to my father's parents' house. Suddenly, my mom saw me talking to something that wasn't there. She didn't pay that much attention since she thought it was just the imaginary friend phase. After a few days, my friendship started to freak my mom out as I started asking why was my friend always sad and why was he allowed to stand next to the stove and I wasn't. She then tried to explain that he was just imaginary. He lives under the sink, I said. My mom told me that I could tell her the exact actions and emotions this boy had. She struggled to make me understand that he was not real, and she thought it was just a phase until my grandfather said he found out a boy sitting at the backyard door. The backyard was a common area between my house and my grandparents' house. He was sitting there in the middle of the night. When he asked if he was okay, the boy said he was waiting for his mom and he couldn't leave. My grandpa called his wife, and when she came out, the boy was not there. My grandparents said that whenever they went outside to take out the trash at night, they could see the boy sitting in the backyard for a few minutes and then just vanish. 15 years ago I worked in a restaurant in a very old building that shared a yard with a courthouse and was the site of a public gallows in the 19th century. The last public hanging was in 1834. When I started working there, some of the servers told me the place was haunted and shared stories of strange things they experienced, chairs and table being moved when they left the room, those sorts of things. I was always a skeptic, so I never really took them too seriously. I had a key to the place and would be the first one there in the late morning, getting things ready by myself until early afternoon when everyone else would show up. The restaurant took up the entire 3 floors of the building, dining room and kitchen on the main floor, bar and the owner's office upstairs and storage in the basement. I was in the kitchen one day. I had gotten there about an hour before and was the only one there. I heard a door close and someone walking around upstairs in the bar. Creaky old hardwood floors, real quiet when you're there by yourself, so it was obvious someone was moving around up there. The owner would sometimes sleep in his office if he had a late night, so I figured he must have spent the night and had just gotten up. I go upstairs and the place is empty. I look around the bar and office, call out the owner's name, nothing. Silence. I've always been a skeptic, but I was so sure I had heard someone walking around up there it actually freaked me out a little. I go back to the kitchen, listening for any more sounds and I don't hear any. Still a little weirded out. I then hear what sounds like someone moving around downstairs. So, I start to go down there. On the wall of the staircase is a huge oil painting, probably almost 2 meters square with a really heavy steel frame. It's a painting of like a samurai warlord or something, sitting in a throne with a staff and wearing a mask that looks like a skull, painted by the owner's grandfather who had died in a house fire years before. As I am halfway down the stairs, I hear a snap and this painting, which must weigh 40 or 50 pounds, comes flying right at my head, embedding a corner in the wall next to me, and I'm staring at the warlord guy right in the eyes. I booked it up the stairs, out the front door and waited for my coworkers to show up so I could tell them that I now believed their ghost stories. This happened a good couple years ago. My friend's mom was driving me home, my friend was also in the car. It was past midnight on Tuesday in February. We live in a super small town that is technically called a village. Needless to say, there is basically no nightlife. My friend and I were in the back while her mom was in the driver's seat, leaving the passenger seat empty. We had started the downward slope of a hill when the brights shone on a man walking in the middle of the road. She slowed down expecting him to move to the side of the road. He could not have been in any less of a hurry. He seemed to have complete confidence in us slowing down. At this point we had reached almost a standstill and we could finally see him clearly. He had on shorts with suspenders, a huge overcoat and boots that went up to his knees. He looked like he was from the 1800s. It got deadly silent. As we got even closer I could start to make out his face. He was paler but not abnormally, and either he was amazing at makeup or he had blood smeared across his mouth. He peered through the passenger side window and I have never ever seen eyes like his before. He made direct eye contact and had a slight smile on his face, and he appeared to be reaching for the door handle. I could only describe his expression as taunting. Looking into his eyes was a feeling I'll never ever forget. At some point my friend's mom came back to life and slammed on the gas. We later called the police station to see if anyone had seen anything going on that night, but nothing had been reported. Honestly, I think we may have seen a demon because I don't think any human can have eyes like he did. I sometimes wonder if there was a reason the 3 of us saw him and if it was a sign or something. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.